How to win a debate without even trying. The Socratic method is one of the most useful tools in debates in order to win an argument. Rather than using ad hominem attacks or suggesting logical fallacies in argumentation, one good tool to make your debater less defensive is the Socratic method. Within this method, you simply ask your interlocutor to further clarify their position. Welcome everyone, my name is Bogdan Popescu and I'm an assistant professor of political science at John Cabot University of Rome. In my career, I taught generations of students how to think about argumentation and how to create a logical framework that's coherent and logically consistent. In today's video, we're going to watch another section of a Jubilee debate, atheists versus Christians. So this is a famous recent video organized by Jubilee in which Dr. Jordan Peterson was met by a variety of people that were challenging his supposed Christian position. He avoided being called a Christian himself, but he was supposed to defend the Christian position. So I chose a video that kind of illustrates the effectiveness of the Socratic method. In the previous video, I also explained further some of the rules of the Socratic method. So check that one out as well in order to get a better understanding how the Socratic method works. So now we're going to watch the Zena Peterson debate. So the claim here in this video is everybody worships something even though they may not know it. So we're going to look at some of the Socratic techniques that Zena is using and how she's able to lead the entire conversation and question Peterson in a way that's in agreement with how she wants the debate work.
Thank you. I'm Zena. So I want to start with defining terms.
That's always a good idea. Defining terms from the get-go, it's always a good idea to make sure that interlocutors do not talk past each other. It's important to make sure that both interlocutors have the same definition over the basic terms. And from the very beginning, she's winning many people's respect by ensuring that there are some common agreements over the main concepts used in the conversation.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the
It's a
other.
hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So very interesting. She's trying to clarify further. Peterson is a known figure for utilizing ambiguous or abstract terms that could be interpreted in a variety of ways. So it's always a good idea to clarify, what do you mean by this? Do you mean like this aspect of the problem?
Whatever you're attending to, your worship.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of this value-laden hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. And
so also you're winning your interlocutor's respect in a way by saying that you're taking them seriously. So you're familiar with their system, you're familiar with their work, and you try to relate your line of questioning to their work. So she's scoring points with Peterson by emphasizing that she didn't come unprepared and she's not acting from a place of ignorance.
you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I suppose. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
right.
correct. Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
So that's one interesting Socratic method here, because she's thinking about the consequences, or it's a consequential type of questioning. So if this is true, is it possible that different people might have different foundational motivations? Could it be the case that maybe there's more than one God? But we're going to see how she gets to that point.
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's where we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
She goes again with implications of the statement. So multiple people may have different foundational goals. So because the foundational goal is God, accepting the idea that foundational goals can be different would imply that there are indeed multiple gods. This is just a clear logical syllogism.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something bought.
Right, but the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah, so at the bottom is God,
Yeah.
and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
Mhm. It depends on what you mean by valid. So So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's what happens in totalitarian states.
So that's interesting. Peterson is also trying to define terms. So Zena emphasized that there can be multiple versions of God that can be valid. So I think Peterson is right to ask, like, what do you mean by valid? And it's interesting that his position is to articulate the idea that valid is deeply connected or intrinsically connected to consequences, is intrinsically tied to what you see at the end, whether the goal was accomplished or not. So you might have a good intention or a good system in place, but you might end up with something that's problematic or something that's completely different from the intended goal. And then he provides the example of totalitarian regimes. The connection there, it's not quite clear.
Yeah?
So you're
So
saying
they're not all equal. Like all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational, right?
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than?
That's an excellent question.
So clearly, Peterson asks here from a position of humility and acknowledges that people have multiple goals and they might have foundational goals that are different. This means that certain foundational goals could be better than others, especially if you judge them based on whether the consequences are positive or not.
Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend. Friend is better than having a game, right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right.
So it's unclear why, because he's already expressed this idea that some foundations or some foundational goals don't play out as expected, such as in totalitarian regimes. On the one hand, Peterson started off from the position that you have to judge the consequences of the actions, but now he's making a bigger point about iterability and breadth of application.
So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better? And what does better mean?
So Zena again is moving forward. She's leading the discussion by asking further probing question. What is iterability? What makes something better? So let's see what Peterson answers.
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily.
Right.
So it's invitation.
A descriptive kind of quality. So talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
Harmony.
Harmony.
Yeah,
right?
that's better. Not happiness precisely because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But what we're interested in, though.
So she's emphasizing exactly what I touched on earlier. Something should be good or bad, given Peterson's answers, depending on the outcome that you see.
What could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it. It produces the opposite results to which you intend. Well, yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right, so the foundational principles are lacking because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right.
Okay.
So we're talking about within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason. Like, stands independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist.
So notice she's moving to a new line of argumentation. So far, Peterson and the entire conversation has been focused on principles of God in reference to a system. And now she's asking whether there's a possibility that God could exist outside of a system. I feel it's a new idea that's not really connected to everything else that she's been outlining so far. So I think it's an interesting idea that she initiates now.
And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay.
I think you could. I think he could, because his whole position was that these values are system dependent. So his position would be that no, outside of the system, moral good should not exist, which it's interesting that he's saying that he cannot define them further when he clearly can, or at least repeat the same position with different words.
In regards to morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exist as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is God. So I want to figure out how
There's an element of that that's true. So, for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. So Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. And those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So now he's saying, in a way, there is such a thing as universal objective morality by providing this Job example. I'm not familiar with the reference that he's mentioning. So now he's saying that by providing this example, that there is a conception of objective universal good and morality that's outside of a system.
Trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stands independently? Something that can be good.
I don't know what you mean by stance. So I mean independent of people?
Independent of people. We can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific. Something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
So Zena is just repeating the same point, because justifiably so, Peterson did not address the question, is there such a thing as universal morality, objective morality?
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal. Okay. I completely agree. So
goal, okay, so this is now compatible again with what he was saying earlier with totalitarian regimes.
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of heaven, of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's in reference to a goal.
So,
or the goal would be the imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
The thing that they want to be in.
Oh, right.
Okay. That's right. That's right. That's good. That's great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their goal.
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Because
that's a good question.
Again, he's appreciating her question, which is justifiable, because the answer would say that, well, it's only related to goal. I mean, architects have goals, professors have goals, like just a job goal is a goal. Or if you think about different religions, that's also related to goals. So in a way, you're in this ideological free or religion free system. So this kind of statement would apply to just a lot of things. What makes Christian? What's Christianity in the end?
Yeah, well, probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so someone can believe in it, someone can have a God, because in your definition, first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right, and not be a Christian, right?
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven.
So not that they're even saying that they believe God.
I don't know, but that's why I'm saying this to you, is that Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And fundamental issue is the action rather than the stated belief.
But he also says that, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins, or that God has resurrected in some way. So it's like, I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that, like, acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, principles of God, like, for example, sacrifice, like you talked about, means that you are Christian. I don't see how you can get that from that interpretation and then, kind of justify it as the truth.
So she's emphasizing exactly the problem that I mentioned, self-sacrifice, or trudging up the hill, as Peterson emphasizes, could be applied to a variety of other contexts or to non-Christian contexts. So on the one hand, there's a problem of trudging up the hill or self-sacrificing could be applied to a variety of other religions. Islam comes to mind immediately, but also other religions. But self-sacrifice could also be used as a work ethic. So the identity of Christianity becomes somehow unclear.
I don't think that the fact that you sacrifice is sufficient to make you Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
Fantastic. Okay, let's go back. Let's not digress too much. Let's go back to what makes someone a good Christian, because we're getting into muddy territory where we're losing track of what we're really focusing on conversation. So again, Zena scoring points for keeping the conversation on track.
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example. So I could assume that power rules. And so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I will. Right, and I can found a whole society, and that happens a lot. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that's founded on the principle, you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like, you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people. Right. So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So it's very useful that he's articulating his position by offering an example and a counterexample. So this is a good sort of debate technique. If you cannot explain with great clarity your position, or if there's so much room for ambiguity and interpretation, it's always a good idea to provide an example and a counterexample in order to make sure that the interlocutor gets the point.
Navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can definitely say it that way. That's exactly right. And navigate is the right term.
So a very respectful way of having a good conversation. So can I use this term? Is this your position? A mix of clarifying, but also a form of submissiveness by asking, like, can I say it this way? Is this in agreement with the terminology that you're proposing?
Someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrifice.
Yeah. The Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. They noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right.
So
that person Christian.
So that's a very honest position on Peterson's side, because he acknowledges, or he's approving of her question, saying that, well, Greek philosophers had the same question. So it's another way to say, instead of saying a good question, yeah, Greek philosophers also had the same question. So praising Zena for this question.
Well, to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern. Right. So you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things. And you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
So then they'd be 8/12 Christian or something like that.
Christian. Well, but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like, I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
It's interesting that Peterson chooses a score on how Christian somebody is. I guess many people would say you're either a Christian or you're not a Christian. But of course, as with everything else, usually things are not just black and white, and sometimes you're more of this and more of that. So it's interesting that Peterson expresses this notion that you can be almost a Christian, like 8/12, so pretty close to perfection. So 8/12, if you're doing the action, if you're acting in agreement with the Christian tenets, but may not necessarily be familiar, for example, with the Bible or believe in Christ or resurrection.
No, I hesitate to do that personally, because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by belief, see, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say,
So he could have been disingenuous here, but he's not, right? Most people wouldn't even question. It depends what you mean by believe. But I think Peterson explaining this, I think it's a justifiable comment or a justifiable answer. Because for him, believing is just acting in agreement with the Christian tenets. In the end, why do you need to make it complicated?
Maybe in the optimal situation, how you act and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing. And you can imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, early comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see
Why in boxes?
like when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian. Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrifice.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Richard Dawkins is like.
So again, similar to what you were saying earlier, the Greek philosophers said this. Now, Richard Dawkins said that. So again, another way of saying, yeah, that's a good question. Like, other people have mentioned that too. So it's like, yeah, that's a good question.
I watched that.
By the majority. Very good.
Please.
You're in Boston.
So you can see how Zena got Peterson's respect just by asking probing questions. So by utilizing the Socratic method, she also prepared for this debate, right? So she read his value-laden theory, his value-laden framework. Now at the end, she emphasized that she watched another debate with Richard Dawkins. So clearly, she was very well prepared, and I'm sure that got her some points with Peterson. So who wins in this debate? Of course, Peterson is a highly knowledgeable public figure, psychologist, so one may be tempted to think that he's the winner, but not really. So Zena would probably be considered a winner in this interaction. So first of all, she has a stronger structure and logic. She always has pointed questions. She started off with the definitions before she even engaged with any type of argumentation. So she tried to make sure that both herself and Peterson agreed on common definitions. There's a clear progression from A, B, and C. She always pushed for more definitions. So what do you mean by this? And consistency, right? Earlier you said, can we derive this other consequence? And obviously she stayed focused on the central issue. You might remember from the debate that she's like, okay, can we go back to what God is, or can we go back to the central issue? So those are always good signals of a strong structure and logic. The second reason why Zena won the debate is because she had better control of the conversation. She drove the direction, she set the agenda. I guess all of the participants in the Jubilee debate might have had the opportunity to set the agenda themselves by asking a question, but she did it in a very meticulous, progressive, logical way. So she also kept returning to unclear points and then prevented the discussion from wandering. You could see extensive evidence of that when she said, okay, can we go back to the original point? So that's control of the conversation. Then the third reason why Zena won the debate is also the precision of terms. So she was always very clear with the terms that she utilized. For example, she used the term of stance-independent morality to refer to this notion of objective morality. She made the distinction between normative claims versus descriptive claims, but also she distinguished between beliefs and actions. So these are obviously very strong philosophical tools, and that puts Zena in a better position. Peterson, on the other hand, he used metaphors, storytelling, and narratives that kind of didn't have the same precision as the terminological framework that Zena proposed. Why Peterson didn't do quite so well? First of all, he used abstract, long answers that could be easy to misinterpret or they're highly ambiguous. He also shifted framework mid-argument. He blurred definitions, like if we think about God as the highest value versus God as the Christian God. So that was never really clear from his answers. And in the end, he was supposed to defend the Christian God. So it's a bit unlikely that self-sacrifice outside of Christian doctrine would be considered as a Christian framework. I'll be curious to hear what biblical scholars or Christian scholars would think about this, but somehow it's not very persuasive to me to just claim that Christian values are just visible in action without any credo, without any declarative Christian ascription. Peterson was also somewhat inconsistent, so he moved from a metaphorical God to the Christian God. He then switched to moral hierarchies. He moved then to psychological principles, theology. So this kind of created both ambiguities, but also possible internal contradictions that made his position less persuasive. I hope you enjoyed this video on the Socratic method. I also encourage you to watch the previous video in which I explained the main principles behind the Socratic method. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. See you in the next video.